Hello everyone, welcome to the workshop Tech Workers Guide to AI and Content Moderation with the Tech Workers Coalition. This interactive workshops will explore how AI is transforming content moderation system, reinforcing biases and being used as a tool of censorship. Our speakers will bring all the experience and expertise to this discussion. Kate Sim earned her PhD at the Oxford Internet Institute. She is an organizer, researcher, and policy expert with a keen interest in technology, safety, and social justice. Most recently, Kate worked at Google as product policy specialist, focusing on child safety with over a decade of experience in academia and grassroots organizing, particularly on issues of sexual violence and technology. Emily is a former trust and safety engineer who has transitioned into a tech worker organizer with 4 years of experience at Twitter during the Trump administration. Emily worked on content moderation systems and algorithms. Now they organize with the Tech Workers Coalition and the Collective Action School, aiming to educate and raise awareness about trust and safety and its impact on digital discourse. Together, Kate and Emily will guide us through the complexities of AI-driven content moderation, highlighting the ethical concerns and advocating for more transparent, accountable, and adjust technology practices. Participants will gain a deeper understanding of the technical and ethical challenges involved and learn strategies to advocate effectively on social media platforms. Emily and Kate, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction, Marwa. Let's get us started. Next slide. We're entering into the 7th month of ongoing genocide in Palestine by the State of Israel. As the genocide continues on, we've been witnessing the information war unfold before our eyes, both in mainstream and on social media. First, there was circulation of misinformation, deliberate efforts to minimize the scale of violence. And then as Palestinians on the ground and diaspora were utilizing social media to document their experiences, platforms responded by suppressing pro-Palestine content and restricting their visibility and circulation and shadow banning accounts. In fact, the ADL and lobby organizations have taken this as an opportunity to ban TikTok and other platforms that have been using to share information and stories. We're also discovering how our online speech has been surveilled and appropriated to train warfare AI systems. So here's a compilation of just some of the headlines in the past 7 months that have been about social media and speech suppression and content moderation. So there is no denying that content moderation is at work and that platforms, regulators, and users are colluding to manipulate the information and media ecosystem to systematically suppress Palestinian speech and visibility to the Palestinian cause. Many of you probably have had personal experiences of this, as you've seen your own content reach limited engagement or you've noticed your own account banned. But how exactly does this work? What happens in the back end? Who or what should we hold accountable? And how do we disrupt and resist them as organizers and activists continue to use social media and other digital tools to be able to get important messages and important visibility available to the larger members of the public? Next slide. So to do that, what better way to do that than to hear directly from tech workers who have been part of the internal apparatus. So today, myself and Emily, we're representing the Tech Workers Coalition. This is a global and distributed volunteer-run network of tech workers and friends who work largely in and around the tech industry. Many of us have direct experience as workers in the various pipelines and the processes that make our everyday uses of digital tools possible. So I will leave it to Emily to introduce themselves. Emily?
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much, Hamla, for having us. We're excited to be here. I'm Emily. My pronouns are they, them. My experience that I bring you today is from my 4 years spent doing trust and safety engineering at Twitter. when I joined the company, there were only 20 of us doing this work. And then when I left, there was 200. So it has definitely changed. And now I organize with Tech Workers Coalition and Collective Action School. And yeah, back to Kate.
Thank you. I'm Kate. I take feminine pronouns. I'm based in the Bay Area. Until recently, I was working at Google as a child safety product policy person within the larger trust and safety ecosystem. I am also part of kind of one of 50 Google tech workers who've been retaliated for our organizing against Project Nimbus through the No Tech for Apartheid campaign. So I've been dedicating my time since then to organizing with the Tech Workers Coalition and continuing my organizing with the No Tech for Apartheid campaign. So we're really excited to bring this information to you all. I know on the end, civil society organizations like Hamle use digital tools constantly and also scrutinize them, but the inner workings are not necessarily available to members of the public. So we're happy to kind of draw from our experiences as workers and draw from existing literature on this topic to kind of demystify the inner workings for you all. Next slide. So to do that, during this workshop, we're going to examine the black box backend of algorithmic content moderation. To do that, we have kind of three major objectives. First is to contextualize the state of content moderation. And second, to demystify the human labor and the algorithmic processes behind content moderation. And finally, share mitigation tactics for minimizing discriminatory impacts that might restrict your work. And to do that, we have sort of a four-pronged agenda today. We'll start out with some definitions and keywords, and then a brief history of content moderation. Then Emily's going to take us into a peep into the black box of the kind of the mechanical side of how content moderation works. And then finally, some takeaways and mitigation tactics. Next slide. And before we start, just some group norms. I know that this conference also has a list of norms, but the first one is actually incorrect. We have recording just for this so that this can be available. Forgot to update that, but we really want this to be kind of an intentional space for shared learning. So we encourage you all to be curious and to be present. We're mindful that people are tuning in from various time zones and are also, trying to do work at the same time and whatnot. So, try to be as present as you can be. We really encourage you to use the chat function on the side to participate. There are little emoji tools on Ring Central to create kind of senses of virtual intimacy as well. So we really encourage you to do that. And then it goes without saying, but finally, if you're being actively disruptive or hostile, we will be removing you. And then the final note is we created this notepad for you all to share the collective notes, mindful that not everyone can be making this time. So this is kind of a nice way for everyone to chip in so that we have some kind of a documented artifact that folks can draw from. So we'll share the link in the chat here and encourage you all to use it if it's helpful. Next slide. All right, so to get us started, we want to start off with like an icebreaker activity. So how do you think you or your organization have been impacted by content moderation? Let's take a quick minute. Feel free to drop it in the chat. What are the ways in which you thought you might have been impacted? All right, I'll just read some of the comments we're seeing. Gotten strikes on TikTok account for discussing and exposing mis and disinformation. We've been having issues getting our posts out because Instagram doesn't like our content about Palestine. Yeah, so many of us as users or as representatives, as organizations have been experiencing various forms of content moderation. So it's very much ubiquitous. If you are in doubt that you're experiencing it, you absolutely are. You've been content moderated. Next slide. So these are all really helpful way to kind of start thinking about what does it actually look like. So to make sure that we're all on the same page, let's first do some defining and key terms so that we have some shared knowledge base to draw from. Next slide. So content moderation is a relatively new field, and as a new field, there's very little consensus on like how to refer to things. So these are kind of terminology that have become like commonly used in academic and in policy spaces. So just wanted to share those so we can like refer to things more easily. First is platforms. We use the word platform all the time. It just refers to a digital surface that's facilitating any kind of activity. So when we're talking about big tech, for example, we're referring to platform companies because these are private actors that operate to manage these platforms. So for example, WhatsApp is a messaging platform. WhatsApp is run by Meta, which is a global platform company. Content moderation refers to the practice of moderating content on these digital platforms based on these companies' internal compliance. So oftentimes these, quote unquote, community guidelines that they put out there for users, and also external policies like in the US, the Communication Decency Act, or in the EU, Digital Services Act, and so on. And content moderation involves algorithmic tools that are designed, operated, and maintained by tech workers. Trust and safety refers to the organizations within platform companies that are responsible for executing content moderation. So for example, Google has a trust and safety team that I'm from. Emily mentioned coming from Twitter and so on. And escalation is a kind of corporate speak, so like a trust and safety lingo, if you will, that refers to internal or external crises that incentivize trust and safety people to fast track internal policy changes. So we'll come back to this concept of escalation later on, but just wanted to lay some of these terms out so that we have something to draw from. Next slide. So much of how we think and talk about content moderation is rooted in actually very specific US legal context. So to give you a little bit of a glimpse of that, the kind of defining legal framework is the Communication Decency Act of 1996, and specifically Section 230. I'm sure many of you have been following the conversation, but if you're not familiar, Section 230 actually is very, very pithy. So the entirety of the language is, in quotes here, no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speak of any information provided by another information content provider. That's a lot of legal speak. So before kind of explaining that, I'll kind of delve back into the legal context. So this came through because of this case called Smith versus California in 1959, where Elizur Smith, a Los Angeles-based bookstore owner, was charged for violating the city's decency ordinance for possessing and selling unlawful books. So that book actually is on the right here. It's called Sweeter Than Life. I think it was just something, I don't know, maybe kind of like smutty or pornographic. So the city had a decency ordinance, and they thought Elizur Smith selling this at the bookstore was a violation of the obscenity clause. So they went through this whole kind of court case, and the debate was about, should the bookstore be considered like a publisher, like magazines? So, magazines have to do their due diligence, and they're beholden to the content and the advertisements that they provide. Or should bookstores be treated like a distributor? So, like bookstores or other places like shops, Walmart, for example, they're not necessarily beholden to the products that they're selling. They're just displaying the things for the marketplace to decide. So as a result of this case, it established bookstores and other platforms as publishers. Next slide. And kind of the consequences, obviously back in 1959, they weren't thinking about digital platforms, but the Section 230 has become sort of the underpinning legal framework that has set out the trajectory of how digital platforms operate. So thinking about platforms as a publisher has essentially granted some degree of immunity to platform companies. And they get to maintain that immunity by doing content moderation as a form of voluntary self-regulation. So technically, a lot of the content that they remove or moderate, they have no legal obligation to do that. The only legal, illegal content that has to be taken down is child sexual abuse material, or CSAM. So then that leaves the question of, if there's a very specific definition for what's illegal, then what counts as objectionable? And of course, this is where the balancing act of platform companies that are by and large based in the US and in the Western part of the world, kind of exerting their own norms and mores while balancing freedom of expression, regional and cultural mores and differences, privacy and safety. And this is an area of work that within the tech company that continues to see itself as like an engineering company has historically been kind of dismissed as quote unquote like NGO type work. So in recent years, we've seen a lot of content moderation workers try to professionalize the space. And that's where the term kind of trust and safety emerged. And of course, in doing that, they really appeal to, like algorithmic power and how precise and accurate and important algorithms are to be able to do content moderation at scale. But actually, when you look at the supply chain of content moderation, which we'll be doing today, outsourced labor of tech workers, often working in poor conditions, often working in quote unquote the global South, that many human rights scholars have described as AI sweatshops. Their work is pivotal to the entire operating of these content moderating machine learning systems. And of course, now in the US, Section 230 is being contested in the Supreme Court. And with that, I will hand it off to Emily to kind of take us through the historical kind of context for how content moderation has evolved over time.
Awesome. Thanks, Kate. So as you can see, many of these platforms that we know of today, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, they were all born out of the 2008 recession here in the United States. And soon after, they spread to much of the world in terms of influence. And very much in a few short years, a lot of these platforms went international. And this is, of course, largely due to, CDA, Section 230, as Kate mentioned. But as you can see with this this timeline here, their growth and power comes growth in being exploited. And most, if not all of these instances are not covered under law currently. And so companies have largely made their own decisions via their own terms of service and their policies on how to handle these kinds of content. A lot of these policy changes that you can see here, right? So starting in 2009, we definitely have to get child and sexual exploitation material off the platform. That is the only legal obligation. But then starting in 2010, you see the rise of spam, and companies then have to decide, what do we do with spam? Follow that, a few years later, 2014, there's a major scandal called Gamergate, in which a lot of women gamers or women game developers were actively harassed online. And so then companies then had to make another decision of like, what do we do with abuse and harassment? The rise of algorithmic ranking and content curation that largely took place in 2015, 2016, 2017, then led to more concerns about terrorist content, polarization, platform manipulation, etc. Leading us to then, once we increased short form video that came in around 2018 and 2019, that's when we started seeing other content issues like international content issues, encouraging suicide, violence and gore, and then, of course, in 2020, and also in 2016 at the time, election integrity, and so forth. And here we are today in the 2020s with basically the main issue that we're seeing, which is misinformation, disinformation, and as you all have mentioned around the stuff that you've seen around with your content on Palestine. So as technology has improved, right, and more content types have come about, companies have had to make more policies, but also have to deal with more issues, right? But they're currently the sole arbiters of what content is allowed. So if you think about this, there is no accountability mechanism other than public pressure or worker organizing, which in the United States, at least, both tend to be ignored. It's also something to consider, which is the scale, right? These companies are huge. They produce they not only have a lot of content producers, but they also have a lot of content consumers. And they have billions of pieces of content being published on them per day, right? So this is from 2021, around 3 billion is the number of tweets generated per day on average on Twitter. And if we divide that into the number of seconds per day, that's roughly thousands of pieces of content per second. So these platforms also have the expectation, though, that when you open your app or when you open the website, that you have the expectation that you get the content either like immediately in front of your face within seconds of publishing. So this means that the platforms also have to get the content permanently persisted and also and train into other algorithms within seconds of publishing, not even. So what does it look like today? As you can see, there's so many issues that platforms have had to put policies and enforcements in. And at the rate of content generation, increasingly companies are training AI models in order to achieve the scale that they want with content moderation. And then also to recognize potential familiar patterns of content that should be moderated. And these models are increasingly being deployed in order to achieve this at scale, right? At the same time, as Kay mentioned before, trust and safety departments, the departments that are responsible for determining these rules, do not always align directly with a platform company's profit incentive. And so the current economic conditions see these departments increasingly getting gutted in layoffs. And if they already are getting gutted, at least in the United States, handling the United States market, it is increasingly likely that the international market is also being left behind. I say market, even though, that's how they see it, right? So in addition, if you're outside of the Western imperial core, your moderation results will just extremely vary tremendously. I'll give you a personal example. So for example, when I worked at Twitter, almost all of our Arab-speaking users suffered worse results from our content moderation models than our English-speaking and Japanese-speaking users. And this is mainly because as a company, we chose to prioritize the US and Japan, given that their market share was larger. And so using AI models is not a perfect solution either. These models also have false positives, which we can then see affect other types of content with unintended consequences. And we'll get into this in the next section. So kind of like the thing to remember, and here's what I like to, this diagram that I draw from is from a really great organization here in the United States called Stop LAPD Spying. We call this the algorithmic ecology. Is a thing to remember that this shows that where we are situated as activists, protesters, you and me, journalists, civic society organizations, this algorithmic ecology map shows that community interests are not always aligned with the operational and institutional interests that follow these platform companies. And at the end of the day, it's all in service of capitalism and continuing the Western imperial project. And so it flows up to what we call, the ideological world order at this point. So how does it work? Why are some accounts getting shadow banned? I saw someone earlier saying, why are you not able to, get your posts out on Instagram? Why are you getting strikes on your TikTok account, right? So this is where we're going to peer into the black box of how these systems work. But please keep in mind that even as an insider, once back in the day, it is still increasingly difficult to understand what is happening under the hood. And so as outsiders, I present to you what I'd like to call our best guess. Okay, you're muted.
Thank you. So examples of content moderation now include a variety of actions and effects that affect both the content posted and content seen, as well as users' accounts. So here we have 2 examples. So on one hand, as a user, if you're seeing the fact that your account has been banned, it's kind of the clearest indication. But something that we are all experiencing is probably closer to one on the right-hand side. This is from a Reddit user who was looking at the engagement. You'll see in the graph below that there was regular engagement, and then after a peak, it just immediately dropped in this bizarre way. So, you have nothing to go off of except this. to see that, typically I've had pretty decent engagement, but then afterwards it's completely shrunk down. So like, what's going on? And again, if you have a gut feeling that something is off, then you are most definitely affected by some form of content moderation. Next slide. So how does that actually work? So here we have a really rough kind of sketch of the internal ecosystem of trust and safety. So this is what trust and safety apparatus within tech companies often look like. So on the upper hand, we have engineering, research, user experience research and writing, and so on. And these are teams that essentially develop, train, test machine learning systems that are used for detecting, removing, and reducing content. And they work really closely with product teams on the left-hand corner, where these are teams like payment apps or messaging apps and so on. So very product-specific teams, and they are incentivized to build new products and new features to continue to innovate and improve existing products. I'm sure in the past several months, or I guess a year, we've all experienced like I remember, what app was I using? I think I was using Canva or something. And then they just popped out like, hey, here's a new Canva AI tool. And it's like, why would I need an AI tool for using Canva? But these kind of features that randomly pop up in line with what's like du jour at the time in the tech sector, that's being driven by product teams. And then at the bottom, we have policy. So these are product policy internal to the company and enforcement teams. And these are content moderating reviewers, policy writers who respond to and operationalize trust and safety issues and ensure that product specific and company-wide compliance is at work. So for example, I worked in child safety org, so I would often work with product teams to make sure that individual product is thinking about child safety issues while making sure that their response is in line with the company's overall approach. And really all of this is essentially kind of governed by the public policy, legal, marketing, and communications team that work really closely. And these are the folks who ensure compliance with regulations. They also anticipate and minimize perceived and actual brand risk and develop company narratives. So these are the teams within trust and safety that work ideally closely together, but oftentimes are extremely siloed. And they constitute how the trust and safety decisions are made. Next slide.
So how do these actions happen? So I'm going to dive into the engineering portion a little bit. This is the system at play. Inside the black box, there are a variety of software systems and services running a platform, but that make up the services that make up the moderation engine are what we're going to focus on today. So this includes a rule engine. Rules are handcrafted by analysts or other employees who perform investigations or are doing moderation. So these rules, as soon as an employee inside, they put the rules in, then all of these rules get executed on a piece of content. These rules tend to be in reaction to nascent exploits that are detected through investigation or through public pressure or through the danger of a PR disaster. Many of these rules are then set and then forgotten. So as kind of like an example for me, when I was at Twitter, the rules engine itself had nearly 2,000 rules just operating on any single piece of content at any point in time. And these rules could also conflict with each other. So they may or may not apply. In addition to the rules engine, there are AI models trained on both content and user behavior that then aid in enforcing certain policies, right? And also keep in mind that these models may or may not get trained on a cadence. Their results may or may not get refreshed on a delay. And so if the model has like a false positive flagged something that it shouldn't have flagged, or a false negative where it didn't flag something that should have been flagged, it's quite difficult to fix these errors and have the model update itself. And so lastly, one thing to also know is that AI models are hard to interpret, even to the people who train them. So there is an increased risk of bias and discrimination that lurks based on the data that is used to be trained, used to train them. So let's like walk through an example here, right? Like, how does this moderation engine prevent the content from going to data storage? What does this mean in terms of like both as like a person who's posting, but also who is loading content via the app? So I'm going to go through an example here. So then something that people may have experienced quite a bit lately, and myself included. So a person posts a story that uses the Palestinian flag and also has some text for raising money for evacuating a family out of Gaza. But compared to the engagement on other stories, like, of their cat or of their face doing something fun, they've seen that engagement on this story has dropped by nearly 75%. And this is a very, very common occurrence. So what's happening? The first round of moderation usually happens at what we call write time. So this is when the content poster is actually posting the content, but it isn't necessarily then shared out yet to people who are loading content via the app or the website. So in most cases, unless the content is explicitly flagged as a policy violation, it will get written to permanence on the platform. So it will make its way through the moderation engine, where the moderation engine may write signals that indicate the content itself may need to be moderated, or the content author may have to have their content moderated, but it will still make it to permanence in the data storage here. The second time these signals and rules are consulted happens at what we like to call read time. So this is when, you as a content browser, you're loading the platform through a web or apps to fetch content to see. And so in this case, the signals that are written at write time, in addition to other signals from other AI models that discuss and determine the relevance of the content to the user, that is what determines whether or not this content should be then shown to the content browser. So in this case, for this example, AI models, having been flagged in the first portion, have determined that the political content should not be shown to the content browser. So then what's the end result? The content doesn't get loaded or promoted, which then, if it happens over and over again to many different content browsers across many different app loads or app website loads, leads to a drop in engagement. So quiz time. Feel free to put your answers in the chat. Which of the following can be a feature used in AI models trained for content moderation purposes? A, the words used within an image. B, the alt text used to describe a series of images. C, the bio of a user's account. Or D, all of the above. And we'll give a few minutes, or a minute or two. All right, if you said D, ding, 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 you are correct. In fact, at this point in time, given the investment that companies are making, again, to automate their content moderation at scale, assume anything can be used as a feature or as a rule in a rule engine. So this includes the imagery itself, right? The imagery itself can be used to train computer vision algorithms that are trained to recognize similar images. It'll be the words used within the image, right? So we have optical character recognition to parse the actual text before going through some natural language algorithms. The text in the posts, natural language algorithms actually are the first kinds of models that were employed in order to do a content moderation at scale. This can now include the caption of an image, the video content, and accompanying audio, the alt text used to describe anything, comments on a post, reactions to a story, any number of features related to a user's account, such as your bio, your display name, your associated links, whether or not a user has certain settings on, so such as like, the show me more political content setting, or show me less, whether or not a user has been blocked before, reported before, or muted before. These are features that you don't necessarily, as the user of a platform, know that is being tracked about you, but it is being used to train AI models. And also whether or not a user has posted content that has broken rules or is flagged by in-house algorithms. So these subsequent flags and subsequent broken rules build on each other, and so on and so forth. So in conclusion, this is basically like slapping on Band-Aids, right? So these systems are a black box for a reason. The rules in the AI models change often, but not often enough to reflect the changes going on the outside. And repeating rule breakage and AI flagging can just lead to subsequent consequences that we don't actually understand or know. And it's really, really hard to study. So yeah, I'll turn it back to Kate on how to navigate this.
All right, so how do we navigate this if it's so patchy and arbitrary and inconsistent and so on? There are some strategies that are that can be done at an individual level to kind of use as mitigation tactics to make sure that your content and your accounts are secure. And we'll go over those. But really, overall, in terms of navigating, the thing that really works is placing the right kind of impactful political pressure. So that's where we're going to return to this concept of escalation. Next slide. Okay, so escalation is, like I said earlier, is a term that's used internally, so corp speak, so to speak, to refer to the fast tracking of certain cases, often due to perceived and actual brand risk, worker-driven concern internal to the company, a random executive's sudden interest in the topic, or outreach from trusted flaggers. So trusted flaggers are these NGOs and civil society groups, much like Hamle, that work in partnership with companies to bring essentially subject matter expertise to inform their content moderation decisions. A really famous example that I think it's a little dated now, but I think it still really gets to the crux of the issue of content moderation and the power of escalation is the case around Napalm Girl. So Napalm Girl, you can see the picture on the right-hand side. This is a picture of a young girl in the Vietnam War who's running away from the bomb and is naked. And this was taken by a Pulitzer Prize winning photographer to document this moment of war. And when this guy in the picture, a Norwegian journalist, posted a picture of this, Facebook actually censored this historic photograph for quote unquote child nudity. And of course, this raised a lot of flags, and following media attention, Facebook within a month actually decided to revert its decision and elaborated its like historic images policy to make sure that these kind of documentations of historical events are not impacted by their nudity policy. So I share this as an example, both to show the power of public pressure in getting these companies to prioritize policy improvement decisions. And second, also to show how kind of arbitrary and patchy it is. The fact that they just had a blunt nudity policy that doesn't account for the ways in which like the human body is represented in artistic or documentary contexts is frankly is bonkers to me that they like instituted this. But the only way to get it in their radar was to have this kind of public visibility. And then of course it raises a question of like who and what institutions are in best position to wield that much political power. And this is something we're seeing today as well, because something like Meta, I believe actually has partnership with Hamle and other NGOs from the Arab nation, but they also partner extremely closely with the ADL. So, they may have partnership that appear kind of equal number of organizations, but the political weight that they give to Zionist groups are obviously very different than what we would like to see. Next slide. So I will pass it back to Emily to kind of walk through how the escalation cycle actually works internally.
Yeah, so companies, again, make policy changes when they have the incentive to do so. And I hate to use the word incentive, but there has to be some kind of incentive. And most likely it's due to some kind of PR disaster that we want to avoid. And so as something that I'd noticed during my time at Twitter, right, which was policy takes an action or an event happens with inaction. So maybe there's a consequence, right? Like Napalm Girl getting taken down or something like that. Public outcry on the decision made, happens as a result. Employees also ask questions, right? There's a lot of us internally who also are keeping pulse and things like that. But the thing that we noticed, or at least I noticed a lot, was that policy used one-on-ones to try and address concerns, right? Which leaves a lot of people isolated and leaves a lot of people not able to like really get the questions that they want answered, and also feel that there are others with them that have the same concern. So many questions still get unanswered. The public is also as well still uninformed. Employees, of course, then grow frustrated, and then this leads to apathy growth as trust is lost, as this happens over and over again. That incentive is, essentially brand risk, right? But the process, leading to escalation oftentimes can also lead to apathy and a loss of trust. So I'll pass it back to Kate.
All right, so what can we do as a civil society? So like I said, we'll kind of outline what we can do institutionally and and collectively, and then highlight some like concrete mitigation practices that we can do individually. As civil society, the important thing to note is that behind every algorithm is a group of humans who are designing, operating, pressure testing, and maintaining those algorithms. So as people who are situated end-to-end across the content moderation algorithm's lifecycle, workers play a vital role, both as watchdogs to make sure that those changes that are being made are in line with social justice values and balancing these different considerations, and also as people who can escalate things internally. So as civil society, the bigger the platform company, the bigger its trust and safety operations. So you'll notice that the trust and safety operations size in companies like Google and Amazon and Meta are significantly different from smaller companies like Discord, Canva, Venmo, and so on. Considering those sizes, it's important to have relationship with workers on the inside so they can help escalate your issue. So on one hand, like I said, workers are your direct line of contact. They know exactly what's happening. We've had a lot of content moderation workers who've acted as whistleblowers in the past several years, right? To bring attention to issues of algorithmic bias, double standards and enforcement, and so on. And workers also as people who can escalate internally. So for example, if you're filing a user report about something that you saw as discriminatory, that case essentially goes into the company's like endless list of public concerns, versus if I as a worker report this using internal tool, that gets immediate visibility. So that's just something to know in terms of like the turnaround time and how to get the right attention from the right people. So really want to encourage building greater relationship with tech worker initiatives and tech worker organizing, so that workers who care really deeply about this and also understand how these tools can be weaponized against Palestinians and against kind of social justice causes can work in tandem with civil society. And then finally, platform companies do have this kind of advisory partnership as, quote, trusted partners with civil society groups. So if you are currently not on that list, you might want to consider joining or creating a coalition to join together. But again, with the caveat that, again, these relationships don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in the political context. So given the political context, we are seeing organizations like ADL having outsized influence in Meta's decision, not only because of ADL's outsized political power, but also because Meta is, run by executives who have Zionist ideologies. So it's not a surefire way, but it gives you an institutional framework to put additional pressure in a way that you wouldn't be able to if you're, it's just existing outside of this ecosystem. Next slide. And then this final slide is for us as individuals, as account holders. So we're focusing, obviously platforms are not just social media, but for purposes of this workshop, we've been focusing on social media platforms. So a few concrete things. One is if you can host content with other organizations, especially that have blue checks, and the bigger their follower, the better. So for example, on Instagram, if you invite other blue checked organizations to collaborate on content, then that will be more protected than others. Again, the logic of social media platform is like the greater the engagement, the greater the ad value, the greater the follower value, then they're going to protect that over like an individual's post. So to the extent that you can maximize justification for engagement, the more protected your content is going to be. And related to that, if you get verified, have the blue check to establish legitimacy and access content privileges. This is a bit of a tricky one, especially on Twitter / or like artists formerly known as Twitter and X now, where anybody can like buy the blue check. So this is going to be platform dependent, but usually if you have access to that kind of legitimacy, it comes with a set of content privileges. And I'm sure everyone is familiar with this, which is that, gone is the days of Tumblr and Twitter where text-based content was the popular way of communicating. But now, in the age of Instagram and TikTok and whatnot, visual and especially video content gets far, far, far greater engagement than text. As a word nerd myself, I am very sad about this because I think Twitter and Tumblr had kind of played a really important role to be able to communicate nuance through text-based content. But it also means that if you want to get people to look at your content, like have the visual, you might have noticed on Twitter, for example, and I refuse to call it X, if you post something that's just text, unless it goes super viral, it's going to be very limited in comparison to posting something with even just like an image of a logo. Another one that I'm sure many groups here have already been doing is consider quote algo speaking. So this is this is a strategy for evading speech suppression. Again, these classifiers are trained in a very blunt way. So they're looking for very specific words, and words not necessarily as like concepts of words, but just a string of letters. So instead of saying Palestine, writing out Palestine with these little symbols, that allows you to navigate and kind of evade speech suppression. Mispronunciation is another one. I've seen people saying like Israel instead of Israel, so that's another one. Another strategy is to post strategically. I cannot emphasize the value of posting during like work days and commute times and lunch times. Essentially it's like people who are looking at it. And when do people look at content? It means, at least in the US context, like Monday mornings during peak commute time is when you get a lot of engagement. And I know it's like almost kind of silly to think about that, but like that's what everybody is. They don't want to go to work. They just want to scroll. They're in the subway. So that's a great time to get your content out. So yeah, utilize kind of internal engagement tools. You don't even need to buy anything fancy. Just keep track of like when and which days, what time, and how things become more widely circulated. And then finally, you can use user reporting as a tool. User reporting is basically any user reporting what you see as a violation of a platform company's policy. It's a blunt tool. We've seen lots of fascist groups actually use this to, falsely accuse accounts of, child porn possession to ban the account, for example. So it's a really, really blunt tool, but you can also use it to your advantage, right? If you are seeing repeatedly discriminatory account, if you're seeing duplicate accounts and so on, don't be shy about user reporting. It just and kind of document it. It doesn't guarantee an action, but it gives you a paper trail to act on in the future.
I think like the most important thing to remember is that it's going to be trial and error. The black box changes all the time. We don't exactly know. It's really hard to study the effects of, speech suppression on the internet and content moderation. It's made even harder, continuously made even harder. So the biggest thing is like, if something doesn't work, try again. And you're going to have to just try different strategies, and some may stick and some may not. So that's kind of the biggest thing that we wanted to impart you on. And kind of just to, again, reiterate that it's a very complex ecosystem of, how content moderation exists in this broader sense. It is deeply steeped in Western imperialism and the legacies of settler colonialism. So it's like very much geared towards profit and power. So as community members, resisting in our own ways continues to be a challenge, but is also part of the strategy. And, we're here to, help each other out and try different things until something works. And yeah, these are some further readings and resources. We can also add these to the notes doc as well if people are interested, and also reference a lot of the different articles that we have shared as well. I know Kate has been sharing some in the chat. And yeah. And I think we have time for questions. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Emily and Kate. We have one question that was dropped in the chat earlier by Amina when Emily were presenting. Amina is asking, would sharing this link in the app reply to the original post improve visibility? And then we have some questions on that Q&A section. Emily, do you remember like which slide Amina was basically asking on?
Oh, I see. I can, let me try and go back to that original slide. In the sense of like sharing links, again, Amina, great question. Thank you so much for sharing it. I think in that sense, I think it's worth trying, right? It's not exactly clear. I can't offer you a yes or no that this would work, because these models change all the time and it's unclear like how they're related to each other. Everything is a best guess. So I would say try that strategy out. And if it, and given also the other tools, other tips that Kate has mentioned, and see if it like helps boost engagement.
I can take on some of the questions from the Q&A area. So I see one question from Reem. I'll read it out loud. Curious how companies take external research from a strategy perspective, for example, like the Human Rights Watch report on meta censorship, and who is a quote trusted flagger from their perspective. This is a really, really great question. Companies do take external research into account. A lot of these tech companies like to, at least claim to be evidence-based and rigorous. So they will consider research. They are drawn to research that provides quantitative data points. So if you're able to demonstrate sort of like before and after, and here is the delta of what happened, and here's how we're able to quantify and demonstrate. I really struggle with that as someone who is trained in qualitative research. And actually a lot of tech decisions are made by qualitative and experiential data, and they're kind of hiding behind this like this idea of number-based quantitative finding, but it is the language that they speak. So to the extent that external civil society groups are able to quantify in whatever shape or form the discriminatory impacts that they're noticing, that gains traction. Because ultimately for trust and safety teams to make a case like that to their product and engineer partners, they are essentially giving like a 10-slide presentation that demonstrate that on a single slide. So thinking about that as the ultimate goal, if you're able to quantify that and visualize that in a really clear way so that somebody in the trust and safety team can basically like screen cap something from your slide, from your report, and share it internally, that is going to get a lot of traction. And in terms of who a trusted flagger is, again, this goes back to, companies do some degree of research, but there is a lot of confirmation bias. So they rely on traditional cues of legitimacy, like many of us do. So is it a recognizable name? Is it an established group? Does it have funders or other resources that are recognizable to many of them American employees? This is super problematic. This is why Trusted Flagger as a program with many companies privilege Western organizations, and they do not have the diversity or the thoughtfulness with regions outside because they don't have people who have that kind of relationship. And this is I think this is a known area. I think this is also a known area that companies have not historically dedicated a lot of energy into, but that's something to kind of keep in mind.
I can take the question from Christopher. So the question reads, can you talk about the appeals processes? I noticed a trend on Meta that content can be obviously misattributed and then taken down, but the feedback loop and the appeals process takes months. So everyday people can report and not appeal. So yeah, so I would also say one thing that I want to make clear is that reporting is a really blunt tool. So there's one aspect of this that's bluntness, is that reports themselves are often ranked by AI in terms of like how likely a report is a TOS terms of service violation. And if that is like, likely, then it gets looked at. And if it doesn't, then it doesn't get looked at. So there's one aspect of ranking that is used in this way. The appeals process is the other aspect that also probably likely gets ranked. How likely is the model wrong versus how likely is it not, right? So, and I think the appeals process historically, from my experience, but also I assume now, is probably the last piece of the system that is the least prioritized. Because if companies are already receiving thousands upon thousands of reports per day, imagine the appeals that they're also receiving, right? So this part of that scale, which often requires a human to look at this content, is oftentimes, unfortunately, not prioritized as well. The most prioritized tools that they prioritize are like the AI models that can then be bluntly used to say, I just want to limit the visibility of this content, which then prevents it from being seen, which then prevents it from being reported, which then prevents it from being appealed, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you, Dana and Labiba, for dropping questions in the chat. We have only 2 or 3 minutes left. So if you can also respond to Labiba and Dana. Dana is asking how meta censorship tactics differs from those used by TikTok, and Labiba is asking regarding Palestine content suppression. How do we escalate this to get platforms to remove these unfair rules from their rule in or AI systems?
I can take the second question, and that's probably going to be the last one that we can respond. Partially because I think the difference between the two companies that Dana you're asking about will have to get into like company specific nitty-gritty details that we don't have time for, but like happy to follow up afterwards. And also because I think Labiba's question is something that's kind of on top of mind for all of us here. So that's a really nice note to end on. So how do we escalate this to platforms knowing that we are existing in a really, really uneven political climate? I want to give a shout out to a campaign that Meta workers are doing called MetaMates for Ceasefire. So there are tech workers within Meta who understand how these discriminatory judgments are being made and baked into every process of its content moderating systems, and they're organizing internally to put pressure. So like, just like how, thanks for sharing the link, Emily, like how big political changes happen, you got to work in concert. I think something that I've noticed having, been a tech worker and organizing both internally and externally in collaboration with civil society groups is that oftentimes there actually isn't a lot of collaboration between tech workers doing the work internally and civil society groups. So I think one takeaway in terms of how do we make sure that our escalations, given the resource constraint, given the bias around legitimacy, how do we make sure that our escalation efforts pack a punch? And my kind of answer to that, and it's hard and it's not an easy answer, is to make sure that civil society groups are actually working in concert with tech workers. Tech workers can, I think a lot of them are very risk averse because you are essentially talking about company details, but there are whistleblower protections that are available. Also, workers can give concrete information or at least give you some pathway to explore exactly how these discriminatory decisions are being made. Oftentimes companies know this and they don't care, or they actually are sympathetic and they know it, but they don't even know like how their tools and systems work, which is not an excuse, but just to highlight how having workers who can provide concrete information can help move the needle forward in your escalation campaigns. So yeah, would love to see civil society partnering more with campaigns like MetaMates for Ceasefire. I think this is also why some of the campaigns like No Tech for Apartheid has been successful, because they're actually behind the scenes been really important collaboration between community-driven organizations that have a longer history and wisdom, like Hamle and like Palestine liberation organizations, working in concert with workers who are doing what they can from their positions. So yeah, if I can kind of give one takeaway, would be more relationship building and partnership between worker-led organizing and these calls for Palestine liberation.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you all for joining us today for the Tech Workers Guide on AI and Content Moderation workshop. We extend our gratitude to our speakers, Kate and Emily, for sharing an invaluable insight and expertise. And thank you all once again. We look forward to seeing you all in our next PDAF at 2025. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.